Gentlemen, I'm C.J. Roberts, the Frankie Duckwall President and CEO of the Tampa Bay History Center, and I'd like to welcome you to our first Florida Conversation event of 2023. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to our virtual audience that are joining us tonight. As many of you know, Florida Conversations is a partnership program between the Tampa Bay History Center and the University of South Florida Libraries, and it is generously sponsored by WUSF Public Media and AARP Florida. Great partners. We're grateful for all that they do, and we're grateful to all of you for being here tonight. This evening's program is a wonderful complement to our popular and award-winning Cuban Pathways exhibit. If you have not had an opportunity to see that show, please plan to do so. It's going to close soon. It closes on February the 12th. After it closes here, it will eventually travel to other museums in the state and beyond. So we're pretty excited about kind of taking our story on the road, if you will, and I think you'll really like that show. I am also sure that you're going to enjoy tonight's program. Our speaker is someone who probably needs no introduction. Most of you know him well. If I were to stand here and list all of his accomplishments, we'd be here a long time, so I'm just going to share some highlights. Judge E.J. Salcines has had a long and distinguished legal career in private practice as a federal and state prosecutor and appellate judge. He has been a mentor to many young lawyers over the years and has received numerous awards from civic groups and bar associations. But in addition to an illustrious legal career, he is also an accomplished historian, and I would say a master storyteller. He is among a handful of people in our community who have worked tirelessly to preserve the rich history of his native Tampa and beyond, and for that we're grateful to you. I'm proud to call him a mentor and a friend. Please welcome Judge E.J. Salcines.
I'm always mindful of listening carefully to the introductions, because Dickie Greco called me some years ago when he was the mayor and I was the state attorney, and he says, EJ, I have a conflict. There's a major labor union convention over in the downtown area, and I have to be some other place. Can you please go to the labor union convention and welcome everybody on behalf of the city? So I said, sure. Well, when I got there, was an enormous turnout. And the gentleman got up and said, and it's our pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker who's going to welcome us on behalf of the mayor. And he is a career prosecutor. He is the perfect prosecutor. He has enough gray hairs to look distinguished and enough hemorrhoids to look concerned. And then he goes on to say, he's the best district attorney that money can buy. For the next 3 years, the FBI was checking my backyard with magnetometers to see if there was money in cans or something. So thank you for the introduction. It was much kinder than the labor union introduction. And thank you for coming to the Tampa Bay History Center. This is a jewel in the west coast of Florida. It has so much to offer. I hope that all of you encourage your friends and neighbors and your children and your grandchildren to visit the Tampa Bay History Center. Tampa has a great history. Recently, we had some visitors from Nashville, Tennessee, and in CJ's office, they were asking about Tampa's history, and could we give them a quick overview? And I said, quick, impossible. And I said, remember that European civilization came to the United States of America through Tampa Bay. And one of our explorers, 100 years before Jamestown and Plymouth Rock, one of those explorers led his explorers up into Tennessee. And it was somewhere in the vicinity of Memphis, Tennessee, that De Soto discovered the Mississippi River. The ladies were amazed that they had not been taught that, because in their early history, they had been told that it was Jamestown and, of course, Plymouth Rock, but they had forgotten that Florida had already been the scene of the entry of horses and cows and pigs and sheep and chickens. They were unaware that all of those were European animals, and they all came to the United States of America through this bay that the Spaniards call La Bahía del Espíritu Santo, the Bay of the Holy Spirit, because only the Holy Spirit could have made such a large bay for the entrance of these ships. Before I start telling you about Jose Martí, sometimes in Palmacia he's called Joe Marty, but the pronunciation is Jose Martí, the force of pronunciation on the last syllable. Before I get started, I want to ask my friend Dr. Lopez to please come here and tell us about the great work that the University of Tampa has been doing, especially with the endowment, the National Endowment for the Humanities. You don't get too many grants out of that national institution. And he and Dr. Ray, who is with him here today, both applied and got a fantastic grant and brought a national conference to the University of Tampa concerning Jose Martí. And then they applied again because so many people had responded. And I don't know what connections Lopez has in Washington, D.C., but the National Endowment for the Humanities again has granted the University of Tampa another grant for the Jose Martí Conference. So Dr. Lopez, if you would please come forward. Dr. Ray, we're going to let him do the speaking today. Dr. Lopez, if you would, tell us a little more about your great conference.
Thank you very much, EJ, and thank you to the Tampa Bay History Center, and thank you all for being here tonight. This is just a very brief comment. Since you all are here, I assume that you're all very interested in the history of Jose Martí and the early history of Tampa. So in the University of Tampa, Dr. Ray and myself in 2016, with some colleagues in USF, under the spirit of Martí, who here in Tampa found his true constituency and used it to try to bring the Cubans together of all classes and all stripes for the goal of Cuban independence, we tried to do the same thing in 2016 and brought the top Martí experts both from Cuba and also from the Cuban diaspora, from the exile community here in the United States and Mexico, and spent 3 days here rediscovering Martí in light of what the cigar workers accomplished. And so thanks to that effort, we began expanding, and as EJ so kindly said, we've since gotten over $500,000 from the federal government to recover and preserve and to divulge this history. So the first institute that we had was in 2019. We brought 30 top scholars and top educators from throughout the United States who lived here for an entire month, studying archives, visiting sites, teaching lectures. And out of that, a lot of wonderful scholarship and also creative work has come out. And I would like to extend an invitation to all of you here One of our participants from 2019 is a very well-regarded novelist. Her name is Joy Castro. And she wrote a novel called One Brilliant Flame that has just come out to rave reviews concerning the cigar workers of Key West and Tampa in the late 19th century. It's a historical novel and also a mystery novel. And she'll be presenting it at UT next Wednesday at 7:30. And I'd be happy to provide contact information for that. Another of our scholars from 2019, Zita Rocha, just wrote a memoir called Guajira that has won all kinds of Latino literature awards. And so we'll be repeating that experience this year in 2021, bringing again the top scholars, including, for example, Ada Ferrer, who just won the Pulitzer Prize in history for her book called Cuba and American History. And she'll be with us together with a lot of other prestigious people. One other thing I'd like to mention that we've accomplished, thanks to these grants and to other efforts of Dr. Ray and myself, is we've been engaged in a 3-year collaborative effort to recover the amazing press that was produced by these communities in Key West and Tampa. They published thousands of newspapers between 1868 and the turn of the century that reveal the inner workings of how these communities work. But all of these newspapers disappeared. They seem to have disappeared. It turns out that the Spaniards naturally were spying on these cigar workers because they were conspiring for Cuban independence and were collecting these papers, and they're dispersed throughout archives, cataloged throughout Spain and also in Cuba. And so far, we've recovered over 2,000 of these newspapers, and we're in the process now of digitizing them, making them searchable, and making them available so that people can explore these communities through their press. And we're also involved in teacher training, training local high school teachers to teach this history in our classrooms here locally so that our students who grow up in Tampa understand what a special community this is. So the last thing I want to say, and thank you for your time, is that one thing that Martí left a great amount of writing, extraordinary writing, but one of the things that all of his contemporaries refer to much more than his writing was his amazing oratorical skill. What a great speaker he was. And in many ways, his leadership, his importance to the Cuban community was through the spoken word, through how he could speak. And so it seems to me only fitting that tonight we will be gifted with one of the great orators of our time, Tampa's favorite son, and a mentor to me as well, and such an important part of what we do at the University of Tampa. Honorable E.J. Salcines, I cede the podium back to you.
Wow. Whose glasses are these? Comparing me with Jose Martí, I sure hope my mother is listening. We're talking about Tampa, the cradle of Cuban independence, and the role that this extraordinary man, this lawyer, had on Tampa, on Florida, on the United States, and in the literary world, especially the Spanish-speaking world. As Dr. Lopez has said, he was a prolific writer, a man that was versed in many different ways, a poet, an essayist, a dramatist, wrote shows, wrote all kinds of publications for newspapers and for his own newspaper, which was called Patria, which means fatherland, for the cause of Cuban independence. He's been referred to as the apostle of Cuban independence. We don't use that word frequently, but if you look up What is an apostle? An apostle is one sent with a mission, one sent with a message for the world, one who is sent out with a special goal, an envoy with a calling and a message to give. Jose Martí encompassed all of that definition. The history of Tampa cannot be written without talking about Cuba and the many contributions the Cuban people have made in Tampa and in Florida, including Jose Martí. The last 15 years of his life, he lived in the United States. The most productive years of his life were in the United States. When the recent government of Cuba has said that Jose Martí did not like the United States, they lie. Jose Martí loved the United States. Jose Martí's most productive years were under this constitutional guarantee of free speech, and he could write on any subject that he wanted and criticize anything that he wanted because of freedom of the press, freedom of expression. E.J., but didn't he say something about concerned that the United States might intervene in Cuba and deprive the Cuban people of their independence? Yes, he was here during the period in American history that we call manifest destiny. We were expanding. We crossed the Mississippi. We went all the way across the Midwest, and we went all the way to California. And while he was living in New York, the last 15 years of his life, his domicile was in New York. But he saw where we acquired Alaska, and we were acquiring Hawaii. And he was concerned that while the United States was in this expansionist attitude and movement, that what they were struggling for, independence from Spain, might be taken over by the United States, and Cuba might be another star in the American flag. He died, but a lot of his preoccupations became a reality. He could see, if we don't get our independence quickly, we might be another state in the United States. And we want to be a free and sovereign, independent nation. The last 15 years of Jose Martí, yes, were in New York as his domicile, but the last 3.5 years of his life, he was almost in Tampa, almost constantly. We've given you the handout of no less than 20 visits in a 3.5 year period. So he almost was calling Tampa his residence. He called Tampa El Pueblo Fiel, my faithful town, because on his first visit here, he found a glue that Dr. Lopez was referring to. He found something to bring unity to all the divisions that existed with the Cuban element. Some wanted independence. Some wanted to be a commonwealth with Spain. Others wanted separate. Others wanted other forms of autonomy. And Jose Martí found in Tampa some glue, some mysterious glue that he could bring all of these different factions together so that Cuba could be a free and independent nation. Who was Jose Martí? He was born in Cuba to Spanish parents. His father was from Valencia. And of course, Tampa has a connection to Valencia because the founder of Ybor City, Martínez Ybor, was from Valencia. His mother was from the Canary Islands. Jose Martí was not just a graduate of the University of Zaragoza, where he received 2 academic degrees. He became a lawyer and received another degree in letters. So he was a lawyer, he was a journalist, he was a writer, an essayist, a poet, as Dr. Lopez mentions, a great orator, a lecturer, a translator. He mastered 5 different languages. He was a professor. He had some diplomatic experience as an honorary consul in New York for 3 different South American countries. And above all, he was an intellectual. Jose Martí is the enduring hero of Cuban independence, of being a freedom fighter, a revolutionary. He is without a doubt the superlative person of excellence in Cuban history and political thought. But he just doesn't belong to Cuba and to the Cubans. He belongs to the people of Tampa. He belongs to the people of Florida. He belongs to the people of the United States, especially in American literature. On January 28, 1895, and that date is quickly approaching, Jose Martí celebrated his last birthday in New York. He had been in Tampa just a few weeks before. At the time of his 42nd birthday, he was in hiding. That surprises most people. Well, EJ, if he had all of these constitutional rights, why was he hiding? He was avoiding the customs agents who wanted to interrogate him because all of his 5-year efforts had gelled, and he had the men and money and military supplies to start the Martí War of '95. But in order to take the men and the supplies to Cuba, he needed tugboats. And he had contracted for 3 separate tugboats with men and supplies, and U.S. Customs had a confidential informant, and they seized the 3 ships up in the Fernandina Beach area. You know that Fernandina is part of the Amelia Island, Jacksonville vicinity. Jose Martí had to recover money. He had to go to sources that he had already tapped, because now the U.S. government had confiscated all of the supplies for these 3 expeditionary groups that were going to invade, and now he had to put those 3 back together again. Those last weeks he spent in his physician's home. So U.S. Customs was never able to find him or interrogate him. But he was always in communication with his loyal supporters in Tampa, in Key West, in Jacksonville. You might be surprised that there were 14 cigar factories in Jacksonville at the time. You might be surprised that in Ocala, they had also some cigar factories, and in fact, in that district of the cigar factories, they referred to it as Martí City. And Martí was constantly in touch with those leaders, particularly with one exceptionally qualified leader. You saw his picture when you were looking at the exhibits as you walked in. His name was Fernando Figueredo Socarrás. He not only was the first Hispanic that represented Key West in the Florida legislature. When he returned to Key West, he became the superintendent of public education, of schools in Key West. And then his boss, the Fernandez O'Halloran Cigar Factory, decided to take up Mr. Hugh Campbell McFarland's offer to bring that cigar factory to West Tampa, where the West Tampa Library is now located. And the day before Jose Martí was killed in a small skirmish in eastern Cuba, that was May the 19th of 1895. On May the 18th, the Florida legislature had created the independent city of West Tampa, of which Mr. McFarland was the godfather, the most important single figure in the development of that second cigar town. It was on the occasion that the O'Halloran factory had recently started operating in West Tampa, and Fernando Figueredo Socarrás, the most trusted friend that Martí had in Florida, got elected the first mayor of West Tampa. He then went on, years later, when Cuba did get its independence in 1902, he went on to be the treasurer of the Republic of Cuba, signing the Cuban currency. So, why was Key West so important? You may not realize that Key West at that time was the largest city in Florida. The major industry of Key West was the cigar industry. But when Martinez Ybor and Ignacio Aya from New York decided to come to Tampa, and they started investing and urging friends to bring their cigar factories here, Tampa became the cigar capital of Florida, taking that title from Key West, and eventually Tampa became the cigar capital of the United States. Martí was an exceptional individual. Some of you are familiar with Martí's poetry. Some of you have read his essays. Some historians that are here have read the speeches with his eloquent ability of oratory. Others have sung the words of Guantanamera, and the words in that song were all written by Jose Martí. So some of you have not only sung the words of Guantanamera, you've also danced to Guantanamera. Some here have done extensive research and study of Martí. Martí was a person that simply could not die. Some people live forever, and Martí is one of those individuals. But how was he, EJ? How did he dress? How did he look? How did he act? Well, this is a great opportunity for you to take a picture with Jose Martí, always dressed in black or navy blue. Most of the times, it was a three-piece suit because the vest was important to keep your chest warm, especially in the northern climate. He was a man that as soon as you met him, you liked him. When you shook his hand, he projected sincerity. He had exceptional social skills. How many years did he live in Cuba, EJ? Well, he lived in Cuba 18 years. He lived in Spain some 5 years, and he lived in the United States some 15 years. How many times did he come to Tampa? I count at least 22. I've documented for you 20 visits. How many times did he go to Key West? 12 times. Of course, he couldn't get to Key West unless he got Henry B. Plant's railroad in New York that would bring him for 2 days to Tampa or Port Tampa, and then he would get the ferry and go down either on the Mascot or the Olivet to Key West and then back, and then on to Martí City or Jacksonville, and then on back. So 12 times we've documented that he was in Key West. In Ocala, he was there 6 different times. In Jacksonville, because the railroad came through Jacksonville, and then it was so proximate to Fernandina Beach and to St. Augustine that he was in Jacksonville 23 times. What was his full name, EJ? Jose Julian, Joseph Julian Martí for his father, and Pérez for his mother. In the Spanish culture, you are the product of a man and a woman, so you carry both the surname of your father first and the surname of your mother next. For instance, Vicente Martínez Ibor. If we would have followed the English or the American tradition, that would be Martinez City instead of Ybor City. Bob Martinez would have liked that. But Mr. Ybor was referred to as Mr. Ybor. In fact, he did not spell his name with a Y. He spelled his name with an I, because in Spain, Ybor is with an I, not with a Y. But when he was living in Key West, they would call him Mr. Ybor. So he got so frustrated he had a judge change it to a Y. Then they could say Mr. Ybor, but some pronounce it Mr. Ybor. We know better. Jose Martí, when he was shot in that hand-to-hand combat in eastern Cuba, of course, there was an autopsy, and we learned much about the physique, the persona of Jose Julian in this fashion. Probably blue eyes, maybe green eyes. He was about 5'5", maybe not as tall as that image, but close to it. He was of medium stature, slender, never overweight. He probably weighed about 140 pounds. His shirt collar was probably between a 14.5 and a 15. Not a big medium, but a small medium. He had short arms. His suit size was probably 36. 38 might be too big on him. His pants length were a 28. His shoe size was a 7. And as I said, always dressed in black or navy blue. The last suit that he had made just before the invasion of Cuba, he had it made in the Dominican Republic. Obviously, he wanted black. The tailor probably did not have enough black fabric, so he made him a navy blue suit. He bought that last suit from the tailor there in Dominican Republic. Probably had 2 or 3 white shirts with the attaching collar, and if he was wearing French cuff, with the cuffs, which were separate. They were not part of the shirt, so that you could always use the body, but you would always have a clean collar and clean cuffs. He did not wear a hat very frequently, but in New York and in the winter months, he used a black derby, but not frequently photographed with a derby. Black shoes, of course. He was always reading. We claim that he is a true intellectual. He could talk to you about all different subjects. A very cultured person and charming, soft-spoken, courteous and respectful, eloquent, never using bad words or vulgarities. He really enjoyed hot chocolate and enjoyed Italian food, especially minestrone. He particularly favored fish soups. He enjoyed a French bouillabaisse, but he also enjoyed a Hungarian goulash. He liked Venezuelan hallacas and arepas, which is what you and I call cornbread, or Mexican tortillas. Florida always remembers Jose Martí, and especially in Tampa. Do you realize that we have more statues, more busts, more historical markers? We even have a street in Palma Seca, not far from the Palma Seca Golf and Country Club, which is Martí Street. Not Marty Street, but Martí Street. Among the profiles that we get, always was walking fast. He was always, it appeared, always in a hurry, almost running. When he went up to his office on the 4th floor of the building in New York, he would take 2 steps at a time, always well-dressed. He always carried a brush, because there weren't too many dry cleaning places. So what you did, you brushed a lot because there was a lot of dust. So wherever you went, there was dust. But if you had your brush, you would brush. And one writer says he would brush his suits so much they would shine because from the fabric it started shining. So these are vignettes that we thought that you would appreciate knowing more about this exemplary person. He always had a bushy, thick mustache. His ears were a bit pronounced, and as I said, he was soft-spoken, very persuasive, not aggressive or argumentative. Yes, he was an impassioned speaker, but when he spoke, people listened. They could tell. Their mental thermometer would tell them, this guy knows what he's talking about. And he was a very conversation-oriented person. He had some nervous mannerisms. Like I said, always moving, walking fast. He was kind-hearted. He had the highest respect, especially for the poor. He would share his clothes during the winter season with people that did not have enough clothing to cover themselves and stay warm. He was refined and aristocratic in his likes, his habits, and his customs. As I said, he spoke and understood numerous languages. He really enjoyed reading French and Italian. He liked their food, French food and Italian food. He had a favorite wine called a Mariani wine. It so happens that the Pope used to like to drink that Mariani wine. And a physician told me, E.J., do you know that a little content of that Mariani wine was cocaine? Cocaine, yes, not much, of course, but people would drink it to help them relax. Well, the Pope was under pressure, and so was Martí. So obviously, they both enjoyed Mariani. Unfortunately, Jose Martí did not enjoy good health. In one of the photographs that you saw as you were coming in, you saw him in a prisoner uniform with some chains. Among the chains that you saw, right in front was a piece of chain that they would tie one prisoner to the other. And when they would get to their hard labor position, they would loosen that chain, and one prisoner went there and the other prisoner went here. And as he is breaking brick in a quarry, this chain is hitting the right testicle. As a result, he always had an ulcer. There was no penicillin. He went through 4 different surgeries, but he would suffer from cold sweats and fever. We've documented for you that in some of his visits to Tampa or to Key West, he was too sick to give the speech that night, and he'd have to lay in bed quiet because of the fever. So in his 42 years, certainly at the age of 18, 16, and 17, when that injury occurred and could never be corrected, he suffered through those cold sweats and fever for the most part of his life. As I said to you, he graduated from the University of Zaragoza in northeast Spain and was living in New York when he received a glorious invitation in November of 1891 to come to Tampa. And the Ignacio Agramonte Revolutionary Club in Ybor City wanted him to deliver two different speeches. The second speech was commemorating the massacre of Cuban medical students, like the Boston Massacre during our revolutionary period. Some medical students had been shot because it would appear that they had desecrated an important tomb site in one of Havana's cemeteries. Well, that commemoration was 20 years of those students losing their life, and Jose Martí was invited to come to Tampa. He spoke on two separate evenings in a small cigar factory. You've got the pictures back in the back that shows you the original Martínez Ybor factory, which Martinez said to his architects and construction, "I don't want any more wooden cigar factory. The big fire that I've had in Key West is bad enough. I want you to build me a brick cigar factory." And that's why we have the famous Ybor cigar factory. But that was factory number 2 for Mr. Ybor. The first factory was a wooden factory that Martí spoke at, but that Mr. Martínez Ybor had given to his Cuban cigar makers, and they had formed the club on the second floor, and they called it the Cuban Lyceum, El Liceo Cubano, where there were shows, recitals, dances, etc. Jose Martí was a most extraordinary person. You would think that he was the Cuban Walt Whitman. You would think that Jose Martí was the Alistair Cook that most of us remember. Alistair Cook was a foreign correspondent, in English, of course, and he would report to the British people on what was happening in the United States. Jose Martí was a foreign correspondent for Central and South American readers. So there is a long list, many of which have been covered by Dr. Ray and Dr. Lopez in their seminars on Martí. And as a result, much has been found in English as well as in Spanish. So Martí, like Alistair Cook, would keep informing the Spanish language readers of Central and South America what was happening in the United States. As a syndicated columnist, newspapers in Mexico, newspapers in Uruguay, newspapers in Argentina wanted to report every 2 weeks the syndicated column by José Martí. As a result, people did not know who he was, but people certainly read his articles with great interest. The word got out that Martí was dedicating his full efforts to the cause of Cuban independence. But in the meantime, he was the best chronicler of the day. He was our man in the United States for the Spanish-speaking reader. He took and treated different events and wrote about it, chronicling what was happening in the United States. Significant events. But at the same time, he's writing for the New York Sun newspaper because the owner, Charles Dana, had befriended this multilingual, multicultural individual called Martí. He was also publishing for the Appleton Company. He was reporting in La Opinión newspaper of Caracas and of Uruguay, in La Nación of Buenos Aires, in La Prensa of Mexico City and Buenos Aires. His articles were appearing in the New York Evening Post. And of course, he created his own newspaper called Patria, Fatherland, reporting the events of the Cuban revolutionary efforts. He also published novels, shows, a dramatist, and his poems. Martí spoke not just English and Spanish. EJ, he spoke English, did he? Yes, when he was a young student in Cuba, his father urged him to study English because English is the language of commerce. So the young boy learned some English, but at the same time, he was studying Greek, and he was studying Latin, and then French, and then Italian, and then some German. In New York City, Martí translated, among many other documents, 4 English language books for the Appleton House that helped him economically. In fact, he translated from the French Victor Hugo's book, My Children, as well as Ramona, which had been written in English by Helen Hunt Jackson. He also wrote interesting facts and information about the personalities of life and time of those famous authors. He was a master at Roman antiquities and Greek antiquities. He translated a number of those works for the Appleton Company. He received enough money to be able to finance his father coming from Cuba to visit with him in New York. Among his syndicated column, you find him reporting about U.S. President James Garfield being shot and shortly thereafter, 2 months later, dying. He also wrote about the opening of the Brooklyn Bridge. He also wrote about the massacre of 200 Native American Indians at Wounded Knee. He also wrote about the opening of Ellis Island. José Martí has 28 volumes in his Obras Completas of all of his different writings. In 1885, Martí translated Notions About Logic, written by William Stanley Jevon. He went on to do other English language books for different companies. Martí was the finest interpreter of what was happening in the United States during that period and reporting his observations to the people of Latin America. As I said, he was appointed a consul, an honorary consul, for 3 different South American countries. After his death, his trusted secretary went accumulating everything that he could, and he came up with 70 volumes of Martí's works. There was no Nobel Prizes or Pulitzer Prizes at the time. Those came later, after his death. But he certainly would have been a nominee for a Nobel Prize in literature, or perhaps in journalism, or perhaps even a peace prize. But he was already dead by the time that the Pulitzer Prizes and the Nobel Prizes were created. The 20 visits that I have given you in the handout material tell you in detail what a transformative event that first visit to Tampa was. And right after that, an invitation to speak in Key West, and then to speak in Jacksonville, and more speeches. And then this very famous picture. This picture is taken, I think it's July the 18th, 1892, not 93 as the historic marker erroneously says in Ybor City. But this took place July the 18th, maybe July the 19th of 1892, the same day that Jose Martí and 3 of the gentlemen that were visiting with him were the guests of Mayor of Tampa, who wanted to show off this brand new hotel that Mr. Plant had just recently opened. So Mayor Glogowski invited Martí and these 3 other distinguished Cuban revolutionary leaders and took them across the new Lafayette Bridge, going over to take a look at this beautiful exotic hotel with 13 minarets. And they walked through the hotel. What was the connection between the mayor and Jose Martí, EJ? They were both very active in Masonry. They were brothers in Masonry, and if you go to the Tampa Masonic Lodge, you see that the mayor of Tampa was very prominent in that organization and building things for Tampa, making Tampa better. Jose Martí traveled back and forth at least 20 times, and he brought some very distinguished visitors to Tampa. Tampa grew and grew some more. And then from Key West came more cigar factories, including the Fernandez O'Halloran factory with Fernando Figueredo Socarrás. It's now time to get the Martí War going. So Martí writes out the order of uprising, la orden del levantamiento, and is co-signed with 2 generals. And now they need to send that order of uprising to Cuba. to their man in Havana, Juan Gualberto Gomez, another intellectual. How do we get this message past Spanish customs? Take it down to Tampa. The secretary to Martí comes to West Tampa and goes to see Fernando Figueredo Socarrás and says, if you read what Martí has sent, we need to smuggle this order of uprising to Cuba. How can we do it? Let's wrap it in a cigar. As a result, there at what is now the West Tampa Library, in the Fernandez O'Halloran Cigar Factory, Blas Fernandez O'Ayoran wraps the trusted message from Martí and the other two generals into a cigar. And then they make 3 more cigars in the same size. And the one that had the message had one little tiny speck on the outer wrapper that would distinguish it from the other cigars. They gave it back to Gonzalo de Quesada, Martí's trusted secretary, and he got the plant ferry, went to Key West, and there was the brother-in-law of one of those that had signed, and he handed the 4 cigars and said, the one that you must protect is the one that's got this little speck. Don't let the Spaniards get this. If you have to eat it, you eat it. But you need to take it to Cuba. You need to go to Juan Gualberto's home and give it to him. And that's exactly what the gentleman does, hands it to Juan Gualberto Gomez and says, in this one that has the speck, there is a message in there. He takes out his pocket knife, because we were all raised with a pocket knife in our pocket. Some of us had the Boy Scout knife, and Juan Gualberto guts the cigar, opens it, and there, wrapped, is the order of uprising. And it is Juan Gualberto Gomez, following the instructions of Martí, written from New York, decide during the last 2 weeks of February when the war is to start. But we must have a synchronized start of the war. In other words, Cuba, with its 6 provinces, could not afford one province to uprise and not the other, because then the Spaniards could send all the troops to one. It must be simultaneous, it must be synchronized, so that the 6 provinces all uprise on the 24th of February. And that's when the Martí War starts. In the meantime, he has met with the maximum leader of the military effort in Dominican Republic. They have all signed an agreement. Martí did not want a military government for Cuba. He wanted a civilian government. I don't want a general making decisions for the future of Cuba. I want the people to elect their leader, but of course you need a strong military. So the military will be under the civilian control. Those agreements went down in writing in what is called the Agreement of Montecristi. Martí goes with General Gomez into Cuba. The war starts. Unfortunately, on the 19th of May, Martí is shot and killed. but the effort of Cuban independence continued. The word started spreading that Martí had been killed. Don't believe it? That's Spanish propaganda. He can't die. A man like him cannot die. Yes, we hear that Martí is dead. Well, after a while, the Spanish government did confirm, and among the Cuban revolutionary leaders, they did confirm that Jose Martí had in fact been killed. There was a big memorial service in West Tampa in a building on the corner of now Albany and Main, a building that was then called Céspedes Hall, and the turnout was incredible. And eulogies were given and published. And one of the most beautiful of the eulogies was published in New York, in the New York Sun, because his friend Charles Dana, the owner of the Sun, wrote of his friend dying for the cause of Cuban independence. The eulogies continue even today. People recognize that people with great abilities like Jose Martí cannot die and live on forever. I hope you take the time to look at the exhibits that we have brought you, that you take a look at the individual pictures that are in front of the larger pictures. Those were Martí's closest confidants here in Tampa. I hope you take the time to read the handout material that the Tampa Bay History Center has published for you, both in English and in Spanish, and that you read some of the other articles, including the article about the cigar that had the message of uprising smuggled there. Jose Martí belongs to Tampa, and he belongs to Florida, and we in Tampa are proud to say this is Martí land. He gave us much, but we also corresponded as El Pueblo Fiel, the faithful town of Tampa. Thank you for your interest. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll take easy questions. Thank you. Any questions? I'll take them.
We have a microphone here.
Microphone.
Sir, pleasure hearing you speak. Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Question is, can you speak on the assassination attempt here in Tampa?
Tell me again.
The assassination attempt where they tried to poison him?
Yes, very good question. The Spaniards were following, as Dr. Lopez has told you, the Spaniards were constantly following because they realized this guy moves people. This man has credibility. So, two individuals with some poison wine came to visit Jose Martí, not in the Pedroso home, but in a small bungalow that probably Cuban General Carlos Roloff, a Polish volunteer who had been helping Cuban independence, had rented a bungalow, and they came to visit Martí, and they offered him some wine. When Martí takes the wine, he immediately senses something is wrong with this wine, spits it out, and the two would-be assassins quickly flee. Martí has taken some of that poison, so they quickly call Dr. Barbarossa, a Cuban physician practicing in Ybor City, and he pumps Martí's stomach, and that is when the Pedroso family says, from now on, you're going to stay at our rooming house. And Ruperto, my husband, is going to be your bodyguard. So when you hear Martí always stayed at the Pedroso home where Martí Park is now located, that is not accurate. Martí had already visited Tampa a number of times before they tried to poison him, but from then on, whenever Martí would come, he would stay in the home of the Pedrosos. And since he was trying to unify the Cuban effort, he would enjoy walking with the black woman, Paulina Pedroso, so you would see a white man walking with a black woman through Ybor City, attracting the Afro-Cubans to the effort of the white Cubans that wanted a free and independent and sovereign country called Cuba. Great question, thank you. Another question. Yes, ma'am. Oh, yes, sir.
Thank you, EJ. I've known you almost 60 years. I remember as a kid when your house on Braddock Street in West Tampa was illuminated. And that was the street to go to. And I was 10 years old, and I would love to do that. Thank you for that. Point of interest. Martí died May 19th, 1895 in Dos Rios in a battle. And he was shot. And it was the custom of the time when an important dignitary or revolutionary anywhere was killed, he would be dragged behind a cart of horses through the main streets, which is something that was done by the Romans, traditions. What happened to be the captain of the Spanish squadron or whatever was a Mason. And he refused to do that. And he demanded that Martí get a decent funeral. And you didn't mention the fact that Martí was a Mason, like many others, like Washington was a Mason here.
And that Spanish military officer gave a very kind and compassionate eulogy.
That was my next point.
Attacking the enemy.
That was my next point.
Bearing a human being who had died for the cause that he believed in. Very true.
Thank you.
You know something about Martí, I'm impressed.
I'm Cuban. And I'd say something to you. The statues that you have there, my parents owned a private school in Cuba. And we had a statue just like that in the front of the school. And my sister can vouch for that. So,
We have more Martí monuments than we have on George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, okay? Again, thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you will take the written material, read it, and learn more about Tampa history and the role that Tampa has played with Cuba and the Cuban people. As I said, you can't write the history of Tampa without talking about Cuba and the Cuban people. But neither can Cuba write their history without Tampa and the people of Tampa. Thank you very much.